Welcome. You're watching Jumpstart, India Today's E-Conclave, where we discuss ways of ventilating the Indian economy. Throughout this week, we've been hearing anguished cries of help from corporate India. What is the government's rescue plan? What's holding up the much talked about Stimulus 2.0? To answer these questions and more, I'm joined live and exclusive on this edition of Jumpstart India by the Modi government's most important economic mind, the centre's chief economic advisor, Dr. Subramanian Krishnamurthy. Dr. Krishnamurthy, welcome. Everywhere and to
Very good evening,
everyone
Rahul,
we
and
speak
good evening to viewers.
The one question is, where is that second stimulus package that everyone's been talking about, but we haven't seen so far? What's taking so long?
It should be coming anytime soon.
Given the fact that every sector and every company is seeking government's help, can you give us a sense of how you see the government's priorities while you work out what can be done and what cannot be done?
So in order to understand the priorities in terms of the stimulus package, Rahul, I think we also have to understand what is the basic impact of the pandemic. Firstly, it's a demand side shock because, if you look at households may not, consume those items that are actually discretionary. For instance, if somebody was thinking of buying a car or maybe investing in a house, they'd actually think twice before they make that decision. Similarly, companies may also think about actually, holding back their investment. So there is actually a demand side shock, especially on the discretionary items, and there are impacts on the investment side. On the supply side, if you think about it, it's primarily manifests when you have firms that may run into difficulties on their cash flows. That's where the supply side impact would be. Therefore, the government's response is primarily focused on ensuring that the demand side aspects are taken care of, and that's where the first part of the package was focused on vulnerable sections for whom the marginal income actually makes a big difference in terms of how they consume, and that's what it was focused on. And the second part now is focused on the economy, especially on some of the supply side aspects.
Okay, let's deal with stimulating demand. You acknowledge, as it is absolutely correct, that reviving demand is crucial. How do you hope to go about doing that, sir?
Already, as I said, the government has initiated direct benefit transfers. And Rahul, here we have to keep in mind the enormous benefit that has accrued to the Indian economy from the JAM infrastructure, the JAM Trinity, that has enabled money to reach the accounts of the vulnerable sections through just a click. Just to give you a contrast in terms of what might have been, given the requirement for social distancing, if you look at the United States, the most advanced country in the world and possibly the best technology, etc., they're mailing checks to people, and they have to print those checks. They actually have to mail the checks to the postal department. The check reaches the person. Kind of difficulties that would have been created in the context of social distancing.
No, so what you're saying is correct, Dr. Subramanian, but when you compare the size of the stimulus, okay, go on.
Let me finish that point. So you can therefore think about how enabling the Jan Dhan accounts has really helped in reaching the money to the most vulnerable sections. And as I said earlier as well, that's where the demand aspect is most crucial. What we economists call the marginal propensity to consume is the highest in these vulnerable sections, where direct benefit transfers have already reached.
Sure. So we've done direct benefit transfers, and that's very useful. However, if you compare the quantum of the help the government has provided so far as a percentage of the GDP with some of the other countries that are badly impacted by the coronavirus, and contrast this with the stringency of the lockdown, India has had the most stringent lockdown according to a study done at Oxford University, and in comparison, the Economist Intelligence Unit shows that we've had a very, very measly stimulus.
So Rahul, here, independent of whoever brings out these numbers, we have to examine them carefully. And I must tell you, and I'll use an example from the UK stimulus package. If you look at the numbers that the Economic Intelligence Unit put out, or even Oxford University, it seems as if they're actually given a stimulus of 15% of GDP. But a key aspect of that includes 350 billion pounds of loans, which are guaranteed by the government, and those have been directly added. Now, you will recognize, and all our viewers will also recognize, that the actual cost of that package is a fraction of that 350 billion pounds. When you do the numbers correctly, it comes to 3.7% of GDP. Similarly, if you look at the United States as well, it is not 10% of GDP, it's about 6.5 to 6.6% of GDP. So firstly, we have to use the correct numbers to evaluate, and as I said, there is another package that is actually being worked on. So when you will compare, or all the viewers should compare, they can compare after the second package is also there. But when they do, they must keep the numbers, actually make sure they're not adding apples and oranges. Second, it's very important to keep in mind the differences that prevail between India and other economies. If you take the tax to GDP ratio of the US, or let's say the United Kingdom, and compare that to India, they are very, very different. And as we all know, money does not grow on trees. If your tax to GDP ratio is lower, you are constrained, and that is something you have to keep in mind. Third point, which is very important, is if you look within the category of countries which have the sovereign rating that India has, the amount is far, far lower than even these corrected numbers. And that's also something that we have to keep in mind. So it is really crucial to keep these differences in mind when we think about actually the stimulus that is possible and what the stimulus that will be actually given.
So the government does have very serious revenue considerations, and there is no doubt about it. So I'd like to ask you, how do you hope to finance the second stimulus? What are the kind of ideas that you are working around with? How do you hope to find the money, given the fact that industrial activity has crashed, GST collections are down terribly? How do you hope to finance the stimulus?
So that's a good question. First, I have to make two important observations on this. Firstly, if we think about the fiscal deficit, the reason we as economists or any other analyst think about the fiscal deficit, it has to be in a dynamic sense, and that's because we worry about, or we care about, the debt to GDP, overall debt to GDP of the country, and not just in a static sense, but in a dynamic sense. And one of the key aspects that macroeconomics actually teaches us is that debt sustainability depends on what we economists think about as this difference between the rate at which you borrow and the rate of nominal rate of growth of the economy. And our analysis has shown that even with 4% just 4% real growth from next year onwards, I'm talking about FY22, because FY21 actually will be lower, even with 4% plus growth, for next 5 to 10 years, debt will come down because the nominal GDP will be higher than the cost of borrowing. So that's point number one. Secondly, when we focus on the borrowing that has to be done this year, we possibly were prescient in opening up the market for government borrowings via the bond index, enlisting the Indian government bonds in the bond index. Just to give you some important numbers, about $4 trillion of money tracks these bond indices. India is expected to get a weight of around 1.5 to 3%. That translates, even if you take the lower number, 1.5%, that translates into $60 billion, which is about the gross borrowing that India does. Now, I recognize that this money may not come immediately, but will come actually maybe latter half of the year or next year. But that gives you the opportunity then to structure your borrowing in such a way, in terms of the maturity, etc., to be able to finance the deficit and also do it in a way that the cost of borrowing does not become very large.
There are lots of economists, many who've done your job in the past, who'd say this is when you forget about the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, you don't worry about what international credit agencies think, and you allow for the fiscal deficit to expand because that's the need of the hour. Is that an approach that you're looking at very seriously, and can we say that the FRBM Act, for whatever it is worth, has been left on the side and we are focusing, many say print money, even if that's the way you go, that's the one way that you could use to fight your way out of trouble?
So, if you look at historical episodes, internationally, for instance, if you take the New Deal that was signed during the Great Depression, President Roosevelt in the United States, or you look at the Marshall Plan after the Second World War for Europe, or even, after the global financial crisis, one does see that there's basically a Keynesian, push by the government, and that happens, as I actually said at the outset, that consumption will be down, investment will be down, and therefore the government has to step in. So there is no question that the government has to actually, support the economy, and the government will support the economy. But some of my earlier points were actually to make sure that we are practical in terms of what we think is possible. I am again emphasizing that there is no question that the government has to support the economy, but we have to keep in mind some of the important constraints that India faces as well.
What I want to do, Dr. Krishnamurthy, is show you some of the comments that we received as part of Jumpstart India. We've done various town halls, virtual brainstorms where top minds of India Inc. have come. They've laid out their expectations, their hopes, their demands from government. I'll play out some of those reactions and I'll get you to comment one by one on those. I'll start with Uday Shankar, who runs Disney and Star in the Asia region. Let's listen to what Uday Shankar says, and then we'll get Dr. Krishnamurthy to respond to that.
We have to recognize that it's a brutal reality that if people can't afford to pay their employees, they won't be able to pay their employees. Even if they get arrested or even if they are shot before a firing squad, if they can't pay, they can't pay. And that's a situation right from the individuals who employ in their domestic capacity to the corporates, big and small, and everyone in between. Nobody wants to fire people. You hire people because you use them to produce more, to sell more, and to make more money. So clearly getting rid of people is an option of the last resort.
110 million plus workers have been laid off in the last 1 month, according to data released by the Center for the Monitoring of Indian Economy. Uday Shankar asks that you can pass a diktat which says don't fire, but unless companies can support themselves, unless companies can find a way of surviving, they can support employees only for a month or two. After that, mass scale retrenchment is the only way forward. How do you look at this issue of unemployment, companies feeling the stress, and the kind of unemployment numbers that we're seeing?
Rahul, firstly, I think it's very important that we keep these aspects in perspective. Let me just point out that in the United States, for instance, the number of people filing for unemployment insurance has reached a historical high, greater than even the numbers during the Great Depression. Now, given the scale of the pandemic that each country is experiencing, India is not, an outlier in this. This is something that will happen. That said, the government is, working on the supply side measures. As I was mentioning, one of the key aspects is the liquidity support that firms need in order to be able to tide over, their expenses, which include their, the salaries and wages that they have to pay. Just to give you some ballpark estimation, typical firm, rolls over its inventory about 4 to 5 times a year. So a 20 to 25% increase in their working capital can enable them to actually take care of their operational expenses for about a quarter at least. Now, these are some of the sort of considerations that are going in, to make sure that the supply side support is provided, in this context. But keeping in mind that this is not something that is happening only in India, and that is a very important, perspective that we all need to keep in mind.
So, do you intend to provide wage and income support, like has been done in several countries, including in the United States, or do you think that's difficult to do in India?
There are many ways in which, these kind of support can be done. As I said, we are looking at liquidity support, which is a very important aspect, especially for the smaller, and medium enterprises, because they rely a lot on trade credit. And therefore, for them, their cash expenses, them being able to take care of that is important. There are many ways of doing it. We don't necessarily have to just copy paste what other countries are doing.
Okay, so you're talking about small and medium enterprises. Now, that's got a lot of big business worried. I want to show you what Harshpati Singhania of the JK Group had to say about the need to also support big business while we look at saving small business? Here is Harshpati Singhani.
The narrative is clearly that the MSMEs, the trade, individual people require a lot of support. But large business, as Uday was saying, also requires support, because large business also means large costs. So let's take it very simply. You have very little or zero revenue. You can do away with variable costs, but you have large fixed costs. You also have your meter ticking. Apart from employees, you also have to pay the banks. You also have to service your loans. So there has to be some support to the large industry as well.
Dr. Subramanian, this has got everyone worried because it's a cycle. If big industry can sustain itself, they generate the orders which largely go to micro and small and medium enterprises, and that's how the economic chain functions. Now, when there's so much focus on small and medium enterprises, the big boys are worried. If that's where you focus your energies, then what happens to us? If we shut shop, then ultimately they too will shut shop. How do you respond to Mr. Singhani?
Firstly, let me clarify, the Reserve Bank of India has taken several steps to provide liquidity. There's also forbearance that's been provided. So the last part of that statement, where they actually have to continue servicing their loans, etc., those have been, accommodated. So through the various measures that have been taken by the Reserve Bank to provide liquidity, which applies actually equally well for small and large firms, their concerns are also being taken into account.
How? Can you expand that a little bit? Because from what we've read so far from our reporters, the focus of stimulus package number 2.0 seems to be largely directed towards the micro, small and medium enterprises, which is what various government voices have told us as well. If that's the case, how do you take care of big business?
Look, Rahul, support when you're talking about situation like this is not just the fiscal support. It's about fiscal, it's about liquidity and monetary support, at the same time also on the banking side. And as I clearly mentioned, the Reserve Bank has already come up with several measures on the monetary and on the banking side to provide the necessary accommodation to large businesses and thereby enable them to actually tide over their difficulties.
I want to show you now what Rashesh Shah, who runs Edelweiss Financial Services, he's dealing with liquidity, confidence, credit flow, and the need for the government to take the risk. Let's listen to Rashesh Shah.
The economic epidemic may take a long time to solve, and we need to forestall that. We need to do things now so that it does not become an epidemic. And for that, I think, as you said, credit flow, liquidity, confidence, and getting the economy started by taking risk is very important. And government and RBI can take risk. The businesses will take risk. The businesses are in the business of taking risk, and they will also follow through on this to make sure we get our economy started again.
So you've ensured that adequate liquidity is available, but at a time when there's a debt phobia pandemic as well, nobody is going to take extra loans. In any case, credit offtake was at a 20-year low. So therefore, you've got the pandemic that's got added to it. Just ensuring that there is liquidity in the market is not enough. They're asking for the government to bear the risk. Response, sir.
As I was saying earlier, there's also supply side responses that are being worked on, and that includes both liquidity and credit. When one talks about working capital loans or term loans, for instance, those involve credit. I was focusing on the liquidity support that is being given by the Reserve Bank. The government is actually trying to support through measures on the credit side. And there are also other measures, for the kind of difficulties that the chairman of Edelweiss was talking about, without going into specific details, are also being considered. And let me assure you that we have taken into account all the considerations and the representations that have been received by various stakeholders, and have not ignored even once in actually thinking through the stimulus package.
I want to show you now what Sulaja Firodia Motwani from the TVS group says. This is about zoning, and remember, as is very clear to all viewers, the virus economic supply chains don't recognize red zones, green zones and orange zones. So let's listen to Ms. Motwani, and then we'll get a response from the Chief Economic Advisor.
If you look at the areas in which the auto industry operates, most of the zones are in red. So very few companies are actually able to open up. Secondly, most of our suppliers are in various areas, and unless you open up the supply chain as well as the dealerships, there is no point in starting manufacturing. It's like if you have to make a vehicle, you need all the parts. You can't have a car without the steering wheel.
So having 95% of the supply chain working is not enough because it's a chain. A lot of India Inc. says that unless the whole chain is completed, you can tell us to open up, but we simply can't. Respond to that, sir.
Rahul, I think this is where one has to recognize that policy making involves not only focusing on the here and now, but also on the medium to long run. The reason I bring this up is if you look at some careful research on another pandemic which actually happened 100 years back, the Spanish flu, what it clearly shows is that those geographical regions that actually were first early to intervene and also then continued lockdowns, long enough so that the health aspect was taken care of, were the ones where the economic revival was also strong. The reason I bring this up is because in the short run, what is being said is absolutely correct, that there is a trade-off between flattening the health pandemic and the economic impact of that, but that is in the short run. In the long run, when you look at it, those kind of measures that actually enable to keep mortality rates down are the ones that also help the economy revive back. There is no denying that there are costs, but what we have to ensure is that we balance between, if we, for instance, just throw caution to the winds and say, okay, open up everything, it is possible that we may actually have so much infection and so much mortality that despite actually the government saying imposing no restrictions, people on their own may decide not to turn up for work, in which case what will we do, what would the businesses do? That is something which we have to keep in mind as well. So let me again underline the fact that we are keeping all these into account. Policy making involves this delicate balance between ensuring that the here and now and the medium to long run is taken into account. And we are actually going by careful research in trying to arrive at these decisions. Remember that this is a period of enormous uncertainty, and whatever we can latch on in terms of very careful research is something that we are utilizing.
I want to welcome to this broadcast now Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. He's been in different positions in government and has dealt with the kind of challenges that Dr. Subramanian Krishnamurthy deals with at this moment. In the next part of this mirror session of the E-Conclave, I'll go across to Dr. Montek Ahluwalia. He's heard what Dr. Krishnamurthy has said and we'll get an alternate point of view. But I have two more questions for Dr. Subramanian Krishnamurthy before I let him go. Question number one, the likes of Amartya Sen, Abhijit Banerjee, when they spoke to India Today, said there is enough and more food in the godowns, don't worry about Aadhaar cards, don't worry about whether or not they have ration cards, give the food the poor. The government's being accused of being slightly heartless. You've done a lot, but there are more people who need food. They're saying open your godowns, open your hearts, give them the food. Respond to them.
Firstly, if you look at the NFSA norms itself, that requires 35 kilograms of cereal to be given to the household. As part of the package that was announced in the first, the COVID package, 5 kilograms per individual, and if you take a household of 5 individuals, that translates into 25 more kilograms. 35 plus 25 is 60 kilograms of cereals being given to these households. And let me give you one more actually, and I'm someone who relies on data rather than just anecdotal or survey evidence, because those have their biases. Let me point out some very important statistics. If you look at the PMJDY balances, and I've been tracking these balances since the 18th of March. From about 1.18 lakh crores as of 18th March, it was about the same amount on 25th March. It increased to 1.2 lakh crore. Note that, increased to 1.2 lakh crores. Then again, 1.28 lakh crores on 8th April, 1.33 lakh crores on 15th April, and then has declined by about 1,000 crores on 22nd April, and then to 1.29 lakh crores on 29th April. Why am I bringing this data out? That if it is the case that indeed people were so distressed, they would have gone and withdrawn balances. They would have taken out money from the bank accounts, because if you remember, the banking correspondents have been actually kept as an essential service, so they could have withdrawn. The fact that in the first few weeks of the lockdown, balances actually increased without even decreasing. And on average, during these 5 weeks, the balance has increased by 250 rupees per account. That's using about 40 crore beneficiaries on the PMJDY. If you look at revealed preference, which is what economists like us actually look at rather than just anecdotal or survey evidence which have biases, you can see that if it were the case that they were indeed, let's say, so distressed, and I talked about the serials that are being given, then you should have seen far more withdrawals on these accounts as well. So this is another perspective that I want to point out, based on careful data that we must keep in mind when we evaluate this. And unless I'm missing something, 60 kilograms of rice to a household is, I think, ample enough.
And lastly, you said that you were expecting a V-shaped recovery. What makes you confident that the recovery will be V-shaped and sharp? It could also be a W-shaped recovery, which means that there could be a second wave of infections, a second lockdown. It could be an L-shaped recovery as well. What's giving you confidence that the bounce back will be quick and sharp?
It could be any one of that. I think not just me, every analyst or economist has to recognize that there is significant uncertainty. And anybody who says that, oh, I am promising that it's going to be a U-shaped or an L or a W, actually, I don't think we should trust that person, because there is significant uncertainty. That said, my contention that it should be a V-shaped recovery comes from research on the Spanish flu. And if you would allow me, if you would indulge me, why it's important to actually use that research. If you look at the Spanish flu, and this is epidemiological researchers like Larry Brilliant, who was involved with the movie Contagion, have estimated it. The R0 parameter, which is actually what captures the likelihood of the spread of the epidemic, is similar for the Spanish flu, about 2.2 to 2.3. Same for COVID. Just as a contrast, for the influenza, it's about 1.2 to 1.3, and more than 3.5 for smallpox. And therefore, in terms of the pandemic, it actually is a good proxy. Now, in another important point, with the Spanish flu, 1/3 of the global population was infected. In contrast with the COVID, less than 1%, so that's about 30 times less, is infected. The mortality rate for the Spanish flu was 10%, it's 3.4%, so 1/3. In other words, that pandemic was far more devastating, and yet it was a V-shaped recovery with the Spanish flu. So the best case that we actually can, in terms of a guesstimate that you can do based on a pandemic that actually is the best proxy, it seems that because the pandemic was far more devastating and yet it was a V-shaped recovery, I think I would say, based on that research, that this is our best guess at this point in time. But as I preambled that, there is uncertainty. It could be something different as well. We have to recalibrate and watch.
And remember, what's making this session of Jumpstart so fascinating is that we are hearing one very passionately argued point of view. Dr. Mantek Singh Ahluwalia is listening to everything that Dr. Subramanian Krishnamurthy is saying, and in a moment from now he'll start responding to every idea. Then we'll have a clash of economic ideas, or at least we'll hear an alternate perspective. What's your growth estimate for this fiscal? The IMF says we'll grow at about 1.9%. From Arvind Subramanian to everyone else who's looking at that says that's hugely over exaggerated. You think it'll be 2% plus? What gives you that hope? Many are saying it'll be negative.
So again, I think it's important. There's been research in behavioral economics that points out, and if you go and read the book by Daniel Kahneman as well, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, he talks about this bias called saliency bias. All of us do this, which is when normal times are going on, we never think about the likelihood of actually a black swan event, we underweight it, which is recent evidence, we underweight. Similarly, now that we're in a black swan event, we underweight the probability of the normal event. This is saliency bias, and therefore it's not unexpected that we actually, take into account only what's happening recently and underweight the evidence that comes maybe from 100 years back. That's possible. My own sense is that, when we are looking at it, there is a likelihood that, the inferences are being affected by saliency bias. I want to be careful not to be affected by that bias, and therefore I'm actually going and saying that it's possible that, what happened in the Spanish flu is what may happen again. If it's a V-shaped recovery in Q3 and Q4, we may have a 1.5 to 2% GDP for this year.
Okay, Dr. Subramanian Krishnamurthy, we've heard you for half an hour. You're welcome to stay for a bit. Just listen in to Dr. Mantek Singh Ahluwalia. He always has very interesting insights. And thank you for your time. Dr. Ahluwalia, welcome. You heard the
Thank you so
government's
much.
chief economic advisor. You've done this and more in the past. Let me start by asking you, Dr. Ahluwalia, what do you make of the government's approach so far in dealing with the pandemic? From an economic perspective, do you think the government's doing a good job?
Well, I think, what the chief economic advisor said, he highlighted 2 or 3 things, which I think are quite important. I mean, one, there's a huge amount of uncertainty. So things could go one way. Second, he said the government has done something, but something more is coming. He didn't tell us exactly what that was, so maybe we have to wait and see. But, as far as judging what has been done, because of the uncertainty, I would say the following. Number one, I think the lockdown was the right thing to do. The basic decision to have a lockdown was the correct one. You can argue that perhaps it should have been better planned, but some of the unexpected things that happened may not have happened or may have been catered for. But because it's a completely unusual event.
Dr. Subramanian Krishnamurthy said so. I hope you enjoyed the first part.